historians first, but we're very glad because we're collaborating with the Center for Eurasian Studies, etc. We have received a recommendation that I'm very happy with to have Ambassador Richard Norland here. He's the U.S. State Department Senior Fellow and a visiting scholar at our own Institute for the Study of Diplomacy in the School of Foreign Service. He's served as a career diplomat for the past 35 years with a focus on Eurasia, Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and has worked on conflict resolution in Northern Ireland, regional conflicts in the former Soviet Union, Afghanistan, and the Arctic. Most recently, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Georgia. He has also served as U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan, Deputy Chief of Mission in both Afghanistan and Latvia, International Affairs Advisor and Deputy Commandant at the National War College, and Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. So I'd like to welcome, please, Richard Norland.
Thank you, Susan, and it's really an honor to be here today and share the platform with some real scholars. I feel very privileged to have a chance. The State Department has sent me here to the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy for a year. It's a fantastic opportunity to try to think about and digest some of what I've experienced. It's also great because I graduated from Georgetown from the School of Foreign Service many, many years ago. Our son is a high school teacher in San Diego, world history teacher, and when I told him about this gathering, he said, make sure you leave lots of time for questions because high school teachers and other teachers love to ask questions, and I will do that, I promise you. But, you know, what I thought I wanted to talk about was to try to get across the idea that this part of the world that we're talking about, which I like to characterize as sort of the Silk Road, whether it's the old Silk Road or the new Silk Road, but we're talking about it. When you use that term, I think you understand the swath of territory that we're talking about. It's a really important part of the world. And as was said earlier, it's a part of the world that we really don't know very much about. I was embarrassed as an American diplomat going for the first time to Afghanistan and then to Uzbekistan to see some of the things that we saw. I've sent around my book that somebody gave me on Samarkand there, and to realize how could there be this black hole in my knowledge growing up. And so it's a really important part of it's a really interesting part of the world. We don't know that much about it, but also increasingly it's become strategically important, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And it's important for the United States to be able to engage there effectively. If it is that important, then how are we going to engage with that region effectively? And it turns out it's not as easy as one might think. And so why is that? Why is that? And a lot of it has to do with what Ben was talking about earlier, the history and the legacy of the history of this region, both the more recent history during the colonial periods, but also going way, way back 2,000 years. And I'm teaching a course this spring on the New Silk Road focused precisely on that idea. What is the legacy of the Silk Road, particularly in terms of political culture, and how do we deal with that legacy in order to have effective relationships in what's increasingly seen as an important part of the world? So one of the beauties of a foreign service career is you get to go to some exotic places. And the first time I landed in Afghanistan was about a year after 9/11. They started putting American diplomats with the Army Civil Affairs teams, and I was with a group of 7 soldiers in Mazar-i-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. And when we would trundle out to the local warlord's city, we would drive by, you could just see on the horizon the ramparts of clearly an ancient city. It was the city of Balkh. And you know, little did I know until I started to read about it, and now lately I've come to understand even more. I mean, this was an incredible center of global trade on the Silk Road, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And you know, thanks to the Genghis Khan and the Mongols, you know, there's not a lot of it, of the historical part left, but it's still a functioning city. So you see something like that and you go, wow. And then in Kabul, I was 2 years in Kabul some years later, 2005 to 2007. And one of the things that you know began to dawn on me was Again, this is an important part of the world. There should be connectivity between Central Asia with its energy resources and South Asia with its markets and its ports. But what's the problem here? What's the bottleneck? Well, Afghanistan is the bottleneck, and the violence in Afghanistan is the bottleneck, and this incredible phenomenon of suicide bombers that started to increase after the first fall that I was there. You know, where does this come from? What are the roots of that? What can we do to stop it? Big questions. After that, I ended up in Uzbekistan, and as I said, you know, when you visit places like Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, you just go, how can it be that we didn't know about this in school? You know, you can make an argument that at a time when Europe during the Middle Ages was going through a period of, you know, dark know-nothingism, science and knowledge was being kept alive in this part of the world. You know, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he's called, the father of modern medicine, came from Uzbekistan. Ulugh, if you look at page 100 of that book, you can see the top of the observatory that he built in Samarkand. It was a 45-meter-long sextant that he built like in the 1200s or 1300s. You know, he was, they have a little booklet in the museum there where they're talking about Copernicus and Ulugh in the same pamphlet, you know, and again, why didn't you know about this? So I had a sense in Uzbekistan of the historical implications, but also there were some current things going on that again lent importance to this idea that the old Silk Road might have applications in the modern era. We were trying to get supplies to our forces in Afghanistan. The principal route was through the ports in Pakistan, but you'd have driver strikes, you'd have terrorist attacks on the convoys, and then somebody realized, and I'd like to say our embassy helped people realize, there's still a Soviet-era rail line that goes all the way down to the border with Termez, right about here, where Uzbekistan hits Afghanistan. And so the Uzbeks extended the rail line 75 kilometers to Mazar-i-Sharif, and we put stuff on ships that would unload in the Baltic ports, get on the Soviet era, the old Soviet rail system, and go all the way through Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and into Afghanistan. For the heavy stuff, cement, food, water, stuff that is much cheaper to ship by rail, and this was called the Northern Distribution Network. And of course, its short-term goal was to help support forces, U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. But our embassy saw it, I saw it, and I still see it as reviving this network of connectivity, which has long-term commercial potential for the region. So we start with kind of something that's a military application, but try to find a way over the long term to use it for commercial and economic development purposes. And that kind of sunk in Uzbekistan. And then most recently I spent 3 years in Georgia in the Caucasus. Caucasus isn't even on the map here. Well, no, there it is at least. But the Black Sea is over here. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with the Silk Road? Hey, these guys were on the Silk Road. There's no question about it. And as you talk about reviving the Silk Road, the Chinese are involved in a very big way in the rail infrastructure that they've been developing all across Eurasia here now also goes into Georgia. And back in December, the Prime Minister of Georgia welcomed the first regular freight train from the Far East, which, using the new system, was able to transit Eurasia in 12 days. Something that used to take 45 days, or if you put it on a ship, it takes 45 days. And this starts to open new commercial possibilities for producers in the Far East who have, it's probably a little more expensive to ship it by rail, but if you're producing made-to-order high-tech stuff, you're willing to pay that premium and get it to Europe faster and more reliably. And so the possibilities there started to manifest themselves. Useful and interesting for American companies, because one of the things this meant was building bigger, deeper ports on the Black Sea. And an American company, Conti Group, which built JFK Airport, went in with a Chinese consortium to bid on the construction of that port, and I believe they got that contract, and that project will move forward. But the other thing that became apparent in recent years in Georgia and elsewhere in this region that again touched on the importance of understanding and sort of managing the Silk Road geopolitically was the resurgence of Russia and ISIS. It became clear that Russia, for reasons that can be discussed separately, is flexing its muscles again in the region. At one point, President Putin said about 2 years ago that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Well, if you're sitting in Uzbekistan or Georgia or Kazakhstan, your ears perk up and you go, whoa, what's next? And what can we do to offset this? But one of the things you can do is develop enough partnerships in the region that there's an incentive for people to play by the rules. If China is deeply invested in a commercial structure that spans Eurasia, they don't want anybody to come in and say, no, butt out, this is our domain. And so China has launched this One Belt, One Road initiative, which the belt is to expand commercial ties, the infrastructure across Central Asia to Europe, and also South Asia, the rail through and road through Pakistan, a new port at Balochistan in Pakistan, a deep water port. So this One Belt, One Road thing is all of a sudden a very big construct. And guess what? The Chinese and the Russians for now are kind of partnering on this. And the U.S. is not sure what to make of this. But it became clear that these represent the commercial side, the economic side of a construct that can help promote stability and peace across Eurasia if it's done right, and if we can figure out how to engage effectively. And that's the question that I'm particularly interested in during my time here in Georgia and drawing on my experiences in the region. There is a legacy, I believe, in terms of the political culture of this region of 2,000 years of nomadic warfare, of silk trading, of empires colliding in this landmass. And I think it's important I think it's older than the Soviet legacy. I mean, yes, the stands are still very much colored by their Soviet period, but I also think that a lot of what you see, a lot of the behavior, a lot of the mentality is much, much older than that. And I found myself toying with the theory at times that it wasn't that the Soviets had colonized Central Asia or made the Central Asians into communists, or it was that the Soviets, the Russians themselves, had adapted Central Asian Silk Road era characteristics. And I'll mention a couple of those in a second, but you could make a case that Russian behavior, and they were after all under the Tatar yoke for a couple of centuries, that outlook, that sort of authoritarian outlook where an ideology, whether it's a religion or an ideology, it amounted to the same thing with communism, is applied to manage and control large parts of the region. So where might this all come from? And what is this legacy that we're talking about? I broke it up in kind of three areas having to do with warfare and conflict, international relations, and governance. For the people who lived in this part of the world over the centuries, during this period we call the Silk Road era, both when there actually was trade, but even, in my view, even when the trade stopped, you still had a Silk Road era. You had this engagement, these confrontations, these collisions. I think the term, trade or raid was often used. The Chinese who were concerned about the so-called barbarians on their western flank in what's now Xinjiang, would butt up against these nomads, and the nomads would, either decide, we don't like the Chinese trying to tell us what to do, and we want some of their good stuff there, so we're going to go in and raid them. Or it's not worth it. We'll pay some tribute to the Chinese leader and find a way to get along here. Patterns of trading or raiding were developed over the centuries here, which I think characterized people's outlook on things and certainly contributed to a sense of insecurity. I mean, you never knew who was going to be on the horizon on any given morning, and you were going to have to decide, do I take my family and flee into the desert, or do we fight, or what? Part of one of the kind of characteristics that evolved from this period of occasional warfare was, I guess, summed up in Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War. You know, the Chinese developed an approach of, well, maybe we won't fight. Let's take the long view. Let's try to, we'll let these nomads kind of do what they want as long as they bring tribute to the ruler once a year. And this kind of, some people would call it appeasement, but it's definitely a strategy of engagement with your enemy, that you don't collide head on. You find ways to, and again, it's summed up brilliantly in The Art of War, you find ways to, in effect, manage or defeat your opponent short of outright conflict. And that's a view, particularly as you move towards this side of the continent, that is very much, very much colors attitudes. I mean, the Chinese do take the long view. You know, you remember they asked Prime Minister Chu Enlai once what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to say. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. And along with that, this attitude of, you've got the cultured people, and then you've got the frontier, and then you've got the barbarians. And the barbarians for the Chinese were the Uyghurs, very much a racist, xenophobic attitude towards them, which actually continues to this day. And one version of these barbarians, the so-called, is it the Xiongnu? Yeah, sorry. These were, in theory, these might have also been the Huns. So we're on the western side, Europeans looking at the barbarians coming from the east, and how do we deal with this? The Huns. These were two sides of the continent dealing with a very similar kind of perceived threat. And the reaction was usually to ostracize and demonize the enemy, often for good reason, but not always. And this attitude of fear of the unknown, of xenophobia, fear of encirclement, I mean, these are big attitudes that color both the leadership in China and in Russia today. In terms of international relations, okay, so say you're not going to fight. What kinds of relationships work to manage engagement between, say, the Chinese Empire, some of these nomadic empires, and I don't know, I'm sorry I missed the earlier part of your talk, Ben, but I had no idea you had Scythians and just so many different empires, Sogdians and others that were very important historical forces in their time, colliding with each other or engaging with each other one way or another, and then ultimately some of them disappeared into the dust of history. But they were really important entities to know about, and they're the patterns they set of engaging with each other kind of set the tone for what's happened ever since. Again, often it would be in the form of these tribute relationships. Sometimes you had actual treaties. China and Russia had a treaty in Nerchinsk in something like 1737 or something. They were already regulating their frontiers. They were saying, okay, Russia go this far, China will go this far, and this kind of zone in between, we're going to respect each other because it's not worth fighting. And then I think the area that's the legacy, the political culture that's really most important, it has to do with governance. Because the Central Asian states and Russia, China, there's still very much an authoritarian approach to things there. And if you look at the history of this region, rulers often were seen as appointed by heaven. I mean, their legitimacy certainly did not arrive from the consent of the governed. It came from some, heavenly force or by sheer brute force. And you had a phenomenon which one scholar calls the Beckwith, who's one of the sort of original scholars on Central Asian history, calls the comitatus. And I don't know if we would call it the comitatus today, but it's this idea that around the ruler you had a loyal cadre of people who would fight to the death to defend that ruler, who would commit suicide or be executed when the ruler died. That changed over time. This sort of ritual suicide or execution kind of passed away, but this idea of a loyal cadre, and part of the whole Silk Road originally was these rulers needed to reward these cadre very, very well. And where were they going to get the wherewithal to reward them very, very well? Well, that was sometimes part of the reason to raid and to find silk and gold and other things, and to take advantage of the Silk Road. It was about rulers doing what they had to do to stay in power. And this phenomenon of loyal cadre almost to the death around a ruler, I mean, you see that throughout this region. And it's I think, rooted in something that goes back certainly earlier than the Soviet era. And maybe just the last thing I'll say in terms of governance is this idea that security was paramount. You're in a very tumultuous region. You don't know who's going to be on the horizon in the morning. You want that ruler to protect you. And if the ruler says, well, okay, I'll protect you, but in the meantime, I'm going to tax you to death, I'm going to marry your daughter, you don't have any individual rights, the attitude might be, well, I don't like it, but this is what I have to do to survive. And I found in some places that there's still this attitude in the public at large that, yes, we think democracy is important, we think individual rights are important, but we don't want to end up like Tajikistan with the civil war in the 90s. We don't want to end up like Afghanistan. And if we don't have this strong ruler protecting us, that's the way we're going to go. I'm not saying that there is no desire for democracy or individual rights in these countries. There certainly is. But it's the question of what's the trade-off? And the calculation in this part of the world is a whole lot different than where we sit with the ocean on each side protecting us. So, again, assuming in a very anecdotal way that these are kind of some of the legacies of this history, for the United States and for the West and others, how do you engage effectively in a part of the world which, again, I believe is increasingly important, not only because of the economic potential that can come from this growing infrastructure and transcontinental engagement, but because if the economic potential really amounts to something, it creates very strong incentives for stability, for all the countries in the region to cooperate and not to have a situation where you wake up one morning and one country controls it all. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, it's important. And I say let's assume because, frankly, in many Washington policy circles, Central Asia is still considered kind of secondary, if not tertiary. And again, as we've been saying, this is kind of seen as distant, unknown. There was a guy named Halford Mackinder back in 1904 who coined the term heartland. And his theory was that whoever controls Central Eurasia controls the world. I'm not a geostrategist, but I think there's something to this idea that this is a much more important area than we give it credit for. And we need to find ways to engage there effectively. What would be some of the things, having looked at the historical legacy, that would shape our behavior? One, to me, would be a very strong respect for the history and experience of the nations and the cultures and the peoples in this part of the world, beginning with having enough respect to actually learn about them. We need to understand the mentality here. If there is a genuine fear of encirclement, if there's a fear that one power is going to come in and get you, if everything is seen in terms of win-lose, win-win, by the way, is not a concept. I tell my diplomats, never use the word win-win in this part of the world, because what they hear is you win, I lose. So one way to kind of get around this is to agree to engage multilaterally on an equal basis. If, for example, the Chinese create an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which they did a year or two ago, well, we might agree to engage, help make it more viable or whatever if it hasn't quite come up to the necessary standards. And that's, but we didn't. That's something maybe will be revisited, but for the time being, we're not in that structure. Instead, where we do engage, where we bring our forces into Afghanistan or whatever, it's seen as a unilateral step that is going to undermine, it's aimed at them. It's ultimately going to take security away from them. So our challenge is to demonstrate that what we're doing is going to add to their security and not challenge them. And in fact, I would make the case that having our forces in Afghanistan helped countries like China. They were able to mine copper out of Afghanistan without having to put a single soldier at risk. I think we have to recognize that many rulers in this part of the world genuinely fear, regime change. They believe that our agenda, the West's agenda, is about getting them out of office. There were these so-called color revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, and some would say Maidan in Ukraine recently was another manifestation of this. This is all part of the nefarious plot by the West to oust me, the leader. And, in Uzbekistan back in 2005, you had an incident at a place called Andijan, a kind of an uprising. And every analysis I've seen indicates there were bad guys involved. They broke into a prison, but the government came in and really seriously overreacted. And clearly a number of innocent people were killed. And part of the reason was they actually believed this was the next color revolution being launched, and we're going to nip it in the bud. So part of our message in Uzbekistan was, hey guys, it's not about regime change. It's about influencing and shaping the behavior of the regime on things that matter to us, like throwing people in jail just because they say something you disagree with. So I think it's important to have some understanding of the mentality of the leadership and their fear of external involvement and what that might lead to. I think it's important to find a common language, that is to say, engage on issues that matter to them. Again, security is a big issue. It's probably issue number one for people in that part of the world. So, we're able to engage on security issues, political issues, economic issues, cultural issues. Well, why not? Let's start with security, And in Uzbekistan, when an old Soviet-era ammunition dump blew up, we called the government and said, hey, we've got Army experts here who can come in and help you manage this unexploded ordnance. And they, this was still in that period of very cold relations after the Andijan uprising and all that. And they came back to us and said, no, let's do that. And that kind of helped begin to break the ice and open the door towards a deeper level of engagement. The Afghan issue is very important for these countries. They're all scared to death that if the Taliban takes over here or ISIS gets in control here, this is just going to metastasize. This is a two-edged sword, because some of their own behavior in clamping down on what they see as Islamists is actually creating greater resentment and a kind of a soil for the growth of extremists. They're also bad guys who have no intention of playing by any rules that we would find acceptable, or anybody would find acceptable. So find ways to engage with them on security, build some sense of trust, and then use that trust to work on tougher issues. We did get some political prisoners out while I was in Uzbekistan, and to a great extent it had to do with building trust and indicating, look, trying to get this person out is not so that we can anoint them as the next opposition leader to topple you. It's because they don't deserve to be in prison. I think, again, in the spirit of finding areas of common interest to build on the economic domain, especially with this new Silk Road gradually developing, pipelines, rail, road, fiber optic, and air. There's all kinds of potential here that these countries need it. They are poor countries. They even Kazakhstan, which has certainly plugged into the international financial networks, oil companies have invested there. They're still struggling, especially with the price of oil down now. Uzbekistan has been much more closed. Their view was financial connections leave us just as vulnerable as any other kind of opening. So we're going to kind of maintain strict control of this. Back in 2008, when the world economy collapsed, they said, "See, we were so smart not to be plugged in," and then they kind of rode it out. But in the long term, it's of course, if they want investment, they're going to have to open things up. But the idea of having these multiple routes, you talk about a rail, you've got some people saying, well, the best way to go is from China to Europe through Russia. It's only one country, But then, there's the question, well, doesn't that give one country a monopoly? So then you've got a middle route that covers, a middle route that goes through Central Asia and goes to someplace, Aktau, typically on the Black Sea, across to Baku by ferry, and then onto the rail system into Europe. That's another route. There's talk of southern route that would also go through Iran. And it's interesting, somebody mentioned Persia and Iran, with the new stage of developments with Iran after the nuclear deal. It may change the picture down the line. But it's just to say that this economic stuff is of great interest to them. It should be in our interest, but our companies don't go places because it's strategically important. They go places where they think they're going to make money. And the president of Uzbekistan would turn to me and say, "Make your companies come here." And I'd say, "I can't. It's not the way it works." But we can advertise the opportunities here. We can try to help the government put in place policies that make it more attractive for companies to come and invest. In Georgia, about a year ago, we had a trade delegation of 10 big companies based in Turkey, American companies, Caterpillar and a bunch of others. And we brought them to Tbilisi with the idea of, hey, this is a good jumping off point to look at some of the potential across Eurasia in terms of the new infrastructure that's out there. And I think some deals have come from that, and there's just a lot more that can be done there. And if I were, Georgetown's got a great business school, and if I were talking to students there, I'd say, start rooting around in some of these opportunities here, because this is tabula rasa in terms of what might be out there for the future. And things will surprise you, like in Uzbekistan here, between Samarkand and Bukhara, there's a place called Navai, and there was an old Soviet-era runway there, big military runway. Well, the Koreans came in, built a modern cargo hub there, and they would take freight from the north, from Russia, from the south, from India, and their big 747 freighters would come in from Incheon and land here and pick up and transfer stuff and take it to Milan. And it's their second largest cargo hub outside of Korea, and it's working, And you're driving along the desert, and the next thing you see is bright blue 747 landing next to you in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It's the strangest thing, but things are happening there, and I think there are opportunities to capitalize on. For us as Americans, even as we look for ways to engage with these folks, we have certain principles in terms of human rights. We shouldn't give up on those principles. We need to find ways to pursue them effectively. It's not enough to stand at the podium and say, you should do this, you should do that. The reaction out there, I can tell you, is have a nice day. Where's the Rolodex here? Where's the Chinese ambassador? What we can do, though, is look for ways over the long term to help them understand that it's in their interest to loosen up, to open up. There are ways for people to participate in things. Water users associations, housing co-ops, these are democratic too. Okay, well let's support those kinds of activities. There have been a couple of interesting reports out just this past week. Carnegie had a report on Central Asia, and then a group called CIGI from Canada published a report by Ambassador Dick Hoagland, who had been our ambassador to Kazakhstan and elsewhere in the region. And both of these make the same point. Yes, human rights are important, but they're not the only thing that's important. And we have to find smarter ways to pursue that agenda. I think what I'll do is just pretty much leave it at that. Again, my basic theme, I haven't said anything about Turkey. I mentioned Iran. I haven't said much about India, but again, India, you go back to the origins, the Mughal Empire started in Kokand, in Uzbekistan, where the Babur came down and into India. The connectivity, I had no idea. And India has a huge role to play in whatever comes out of this new Silk Road construct now. Resolving Afghanistan is going to be very important to it, and to resolve Afghanistan, we've got to find a way for India and Pakistan to trust each other more now. So I guess my bottom line is there are opportunities here now for big picture diplomacy, high stakes geopolitics aimed that involve Russia, China, the United States, Europe, Turkey, Iran, India, Pakistan. And the question is, will the structures fall into place? Will the next administration seize these opportunities? And how do we reconfigure ourselves as a government to deal with these things? And how do we reconfigure ourselves as a society with business and culture to take advantage of these opportunities? Of course, at the end of the day, the role of the teachers is pivotal, and I salute you for what you do, and I think it's fantastic that you're interested enough in this subject to be here today. So I'm happy to take some questions.
I'm curious, you began with the word engagement. Can you elaborate on your point of view with regard to that word historically? Is that language that comes out of U.S. diplomacy as a policy term? How do you define U.S. diplomatic
Well, I think in diplomatic terms, engagement means you talk rather than isolate. Sanctions is not engagement. Now, engagement sometimes is called appeasement. Poor old Neville Chamberlain came away from Munich having engaged and will go down in history as, the great appeaser. Some people will say, yeah, but he actually bought 2 years of peace, but anyway. But, there was the term constructive engagement with South Africa back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. U.S. policy towards South Africa was called constructive engagement. The idea was that there were elements of the apartheid regime that were maybe loosening up, going to be more progressive. If you engage with them, you can kind of push them gradually to. But in terms of black Africans, constructive engagement meant, coddling an apartheid regime. In Uzbekistan, every diplomat on the ground said, look, I know this is a tough regime, I know it's a dictatorship, but the only way you're going to make progress in this country is to engage. You talk, you have cultural programs, you try to get your companies in, you have, again, if we have experts who can help them dismantle unexploded ordnance, something, you will have critics say, well, too much engagement coddles a dictatorship. Okay, it has to be calibrated. You can't treat people who are brutal dictators as normal partners. But if you want to have something going on that's going to move things in the right direction, some form of engagement along these different channels, political, economic, cultural, can make a difference, hopefully. And again, the alternative, what's the alternative to engagement? If it's just standing up and lecturing from the podium, is that going to work? Nobody likes to be ostracized. Maybe it will work, but you have to make that calculation. The days when we went in and sent the people to topple governments and take out rulers, those days are gone. So how do you engage effectively is the question.
Well, if people are aware of the history of our engagement in Iran, for example, certainly in Afghanistan, obviously in Iraq, how then do you work in I'm not talking about constructive engagement, but how do you work in a more positive way with regard to people who are aware of our other types of engagement, i.e. political regime change? I'm really curious about this.
Well, it's a moving picture. Again, There was a time when, you know, people would go in and try to assassinate foreign leaders, and then it was made illegal in U.S. law to assassinate foreign leaders. You know, we don't do that. You know, I think people might also say that in recent years, you know, although we sent in our military in a big way and resulted in regime change, say in Iraq or in Libya, okay, but are we better off? People are asking that question now. So hopefully we're going to learn from our experience. You know, there are plenty of issues out there now. Syria, Assad. So is the answer to get rid of Assad? Is the answer to get rid of Assad this week or next week? You know, people will hopefully learn from recent history and kind of come up with more effective approaches. I'm not sure if I'm completely getting your...
I appreciate your answer. I'm curious how the policy of rendition is impacting issues in Central Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we do rendition anymore.
But we have very recently, so in terms of...
After 9/11, there's some, you know, I mean, I don't have any personal experience with that. We didn't render anybody to Uzbekistan. I think it's generally being viewed now as not one of the, you know, one of our finer moments. And it's tied also to the question of trying to close Guantanamo, which is a very tough issue for this administration. But, you know, if the idea of rendition was to take a guy who you think is a suspect and send him to a country that will torture him because we can't torture him, well, that's really not in accordance with our principles. And the fact that it happened is something we should probably be ashamed of. You know, it happens that our son, who I was telling you about, and our daughter, who's an Arabic speaker, interviewed a guy named Rumagien, who was one of the detainees in Guantanamo. He was there for 7 years, but he's one of these guys who literally was picked up because he knew he just happened to go to the wrong barber shop. I mean, and he spent 7 years in Guantanamo until the Supreme Court ruled that his case should be reviewed by a judge who, when he looked at the evidence, immediately said, "You have no business being detained." So our system kind of came through there belatedly. But it's still something that we need to resist the temptation to, you know, go against our own principles, even though circumstances might be desperate. Yes, sir.
I think your experience.
Can you speak louder, please?
Say it again?
I can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay. I think you're the right person to ask your experience in the policy at the State Department, your engagement. There is this one line in, you know, quoted off, you know,
Maybe you could come up here and speak into the microphone because I can't hear you. Come up here, please. No, come here, sir. No, you're on stage now. No. It's too important.
Okay.
Please. Please.
Yes, it's this one line that says in Arabic, it's an Arab academic who used to say that, referring to Britain, an empire where the sun never sets. I mean,
Empire where the sun never sets.
Then looking at this saying, and then a lot of people try to, you know, refer to the United States as representative of this one line. I mean, looking at U.S. engagement in Eurasia, in Afghanistan, in the so-called heartland, and the backlash, of course, is the State Department studying this as a phenomenon and looking at the sustainability of the boomerang effect? I mean, the sustainability of the engagement, if there is a need to revise notes, you know, long-term effect of that, and if there is a need to kind of, you know, tweak that, I mean, to make sure that there is a sustainable foreign policy with regards to that part of the world.
Okay. Yeah. That's a big question. One thing I would say is that not only the State Department would evaluate the impact of our policy, but the American voters also evaluate the policy, and I think people might assess that President Obama was elected on the platform of stepping back from these broad military engagements in this part of the world. That now, but if the thrust of your question is it worth being in Afghanistan, for example, I think it's important to remember why we went in there. It had nothing to do with an empire. It had everything to do with going after people who had harbored bin Laden and attacked the United States. And in the 10, 12 years that we've been there, there have been cycles of, well, we're here, the answer is to build a modern Western democracy in Afghanistan so that this can never happen again. I think we learned that that's not going to happen. On the other hand, I think we're seeing, right as we saw President Obama's decision to keep 10,000 troops there for at least another year, a recognition that to simply walk away from this, it could also be tragic. And the question is finding the right balance. But it's really important to remember that we have not forced our way into Afghanistan now, after that initial invasion. The Afghan government wants us there. We are not there alone. NATO is there. I remember at the airport in Kabul, there were like 60 flags of all the countries that had a presence in the mission in Afghanistan, whether it was military or medical or schools or whatever. But this was truly a noble international mission to try to help one of the poorest countries on earth and make sure it didn't become a platform for bad guys. And unfortunately, this whole part of the world right now, with the resurgence of extremism, with ISIS, is at risk. And nobody's really cracked the code on how do we deal with this. Certainly you don't make it, I don't think anybody has the idea that a U.S. empire could solve the problem. But neither is sort of pulling out entirely from this likely to solve the problem. And some of the roots of this kind of behavior, is what the Mongols did that different from what ISIS is doing now? Some of the phenomena need to be studied going way back, and I think it's terribly important to find partners and allies who understand the core issues. These are very fragile states. Just because we have the 5 stands here right now with the current borders they have doesn't mean that they're going to last. We certainly hope they do, and we defend their right to. But as we've seen in Africa and elsewhere, colonial era boundaries aren't necessarily fixed for all time. And you've got groups like ISIS trying to redraw the borders. How do we deal with that? How do leaders in Islam deal with this? It's a huge global challenge. It has nothing to do with an American empire, in my view. Yes, ma'am.
However, the U.S. has meddled so much in so many countries and has many times built these dictators. And the outside world sometimes looks at the United States and say, how can the United States come and bring democracy when they don't have democracy in their own country? And why doesn't the U.S. work more on really being democratic in the true sense? Because going back to Bush and the whole thing with the weapons of mass destruction, it was for oil. Always money, money, money. So, maybe I'm becoming cynical. I'm an idealist, but I'm being touched a little bit, okay? Because how can the U.S. do this? Destroy the infrastructure. Okay, we build it again. I don't know how much we rebuild. But, going in these countries and damage and kill so many people. Of course, you don't do it intentionally, but it happens. So people don't respect, especially from these extremist countries, so to speak. They can't respect the U.S. Believe me, I love the U.S., but I don't love some things that we do.
Well, you're not alone, and I think the only thing I'd say a couple of things. First of all, what is somewhat unique about the United States is that we do have a debate inside the country about what kinds of behaviors are appropriate and inappropriate. And some of the stuff that you talked about, the meddling that happened, was the subject of congressional hearings and criticism, and things were changed. Again, for example, going back to like what we did in Chile with Pinochet, that was exposed, the law was changed. There aren't many countries that go through this process of self-correction the way we do. But that still doesn't mean we always get it right. And, some also circumstances change. I mean, if as you say, we went into Iraq because of oil, well, we don't need Middle Eastern oil anymore, quite honestly. I think that is a whole revolution.
Yes, but look at the damage that we did.
Incredible
Look at how
damage was
many
done. And
people
I was
died.
somebody at the time, I thought, I supported the invasion because, Saddam Hussein was such a brutal dictator. I had been working on some Middle Eastern issues, and everybody I talked to said, you can only compare him to Stalin or Hitler. It's that level of sadistic brutality. He had flouted UN resolutions for a decade, so the international community's credibility was at stake. We were told, and I believe, was creating weapons of mass destruction, and he was engaging with terrorists. Well, it turned out that the part about weapons of mass destruction, we were misled. And I'm actually very proud of a colleague of mine at the State Department, who's one of the few analysts in the intelligence community, said, wait a minute, this stuff doesn't add up. This is not, what we're seeing here is not it's not the wherewithal for weapons of mass destruction, for nuclear things. And he's sort of the asterisk, the footnote, when you see these studies that the intelligence community concurred, when poor Colin Powell had to stand at the UN there and say there's WMD going on and the intelligence community supports it. Actually, there were some people who said no, and Greg Thielman, who's now at the Arms Control Association, is one of those people. But for all of those reasons, and many people supported the invasion, but in retrospect, it created a lot of havoc, and I can't argue with you there. Again, it's one of those things we hope we're going to learn from our mistakes. The last thing I just say is, as much as there are people out there who criticize the United States, it's also amazing to me, having been out, for more than half of my career, how many people, either want the United States to be engaged there, or at least care what we think and what we say. One of their first questions, what's Washington saying? And again, when I talk about what's said from the podium, I mean, it is important because people want to know what's the opinion in Washington. Maybe nowadays they also want to know what's the opinion in Moscow and Beijing also, and that's fine. But they want to know what Washington thinks, and as much as there's people out there who fear or are suspicious of greater U.S. involvement and presence in a region, I'll tell you, there are so many people whose biggest fear is that the United States is going to pull out of a region. And so, the challenge for policymakers and for the politicians and the administration is to find that right level of engagement that meets our interests in a shifting global environment. Yes?
I have a question about the color revolutions. You mentioned that in Central Asia, some people are wary of U.S. engagement, that history. And I remember I was working at an NGO in China for a while, for about 5 years, and I remember that coming up, and I hadn't heard of the color revolutions before, but we were really getting a lot of increasing suspicion as an American NGO in China, because this was right after the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And then there was the Jasmine Revolution in Beijing that didn't really happen.
Oh, yeah.
They were supposed to meet at the McDonald's in Wangfujing, the shopping area, and our then ambassador, John Huntsman, happened to be there when some people on social media in China had said that was the appointed time to meet. I think it was probably a setup. I don't think he actually. Anyway, so everyone was up in arms in China that knew about it, which was almost no one, because it's blocked. But anyhow, people started talking about, well, this is just like the color revolutions when the CIA was active in Central Asia under the auspices of NGOs and nonprofits. And I'm curious, what does that conversation look like in Central Asia as a diplomat, what do you hear people say? How do you respond? What is the U.S. government's line on that?
Well, I mean,
Could I just ask, could you clarify or define what you're talking about when you say cola revolution?
Color revolution.
Color, oh,
The
like
color revolution.
Ukraine.
So
Orange
keep it in
revolution,
one better.
rose revolution.
Color,
yeah.
color, I got it, okay.
Well, I mean, one way in which this manifests itself is when I arrived in Uzbekistan in 2007, one of the first things you do as ambassadors is present a copy of your credentials to the foreign ministry, and then a few days later, or whenever they're ready, you have a formal presentation to the head of state. When I presented the copy of my credentials to the deputy foreign minister, he proceeded to give me a serious head scrubbing on my role as ambassador. And he showed me some pictures of one of our diplomats meeting with some imam. He said, this is the kind of stuff that should not be happening. The embassy shouldn't be doing this. He said, we don't go around meeting your street people in Washington, so you don't need to meet with the Gregs of our society. And so it was a very sort of clear, we know what you guys are up to. You're trying to lay the groundwork for a color revolution. We're on to you. Don't do it. Now, they might have just kicked us out, but they didn't, because they don't want to be left only to the Russians and the Chinese. They want the Americans there. They want the Europeans there, but they want us there on their terms. And so, again, the challenge is how to have enough sort of back and forth to be able to be there in a way that works for us. And we can't just sort of embrace an authoritarian regime, but maybe we can find a way to be there and help move things in the right direction while respecting the fact that it's up to the people of that country themselves to choose who should be in charge. It's a tricky thing. NGOs, there's a lot of suspicion towards what NGOs are doing, and people often believe, oh, they're working for the U.S. government, or they have some hidden agenda. Actually, there's a very interesting piece I meant to mention in respect to the last question. I just saw it yesterday. I think it was from the Atlantic Council. A guy named Thomas Carruthers has written a piece on how American democracy promotion created from the ground up. Because the work that our NGOs are doing is not only not working in many cases, but precisely because of your point, ma'am, that the United States itself, our democracy is going through some wrinkles as well right now. And his recommendation at the end was that these NGOs should not only work on democracy building overseas, they should work on democracy building in the U.S. Now I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but this looks like a serious piece. I'm not endorsing it or whatever, but I'm simply saying the question is very much a relevant one. Isn't it time to review how we promote democracy in the world? Because in many places it's not only not working, it's counterproductive. It's making them clamp down more because they think we're up to something. Yes, sir.
I just want to say, as a 70-plus-year-old American, that I'm so angry about the role of the United States in the world that on an occasion like this, I find it difficult even to ask questions.
I'm sorry to hear that. I understand.
I got a mainstream education in the United States. I thought not that I wanted to be part of the establishment or whatever, but my life has been colored by the Cold War, by the Vietnam era, by our role in Central America, Iran-Contra, if you want to think of that. Then afterwards, with the Bush administration, and although you wanted to say, and I tend to agree with you, that our role in Afghanistan can be justified, I thought what we did in Iraq, and I consider the Bush regime to be sort of a criminal regime in that respect, and I have harsh words. And I don't mean to attack you personally. You may be simply a messenger. But it seems to me, looking back, that after World War II, we sort of took on the mantle of world colonialism as the European empire, imperial colonialism faded. We sort of took that up. And although maybe we don't have we don't conquer areas and so on, it seems like through our business ventures, And I agree with you that we ought to be a player in the world. We ought to engage the world. But does that mean we also come along with our military clout? I mean, she said it much better than me, but I'm just sort of echoing some of those sentiments. You know, I think we're widely regarded as, you know, the imperial force in the world today, because we come in with our military and we'll enforce things if they don't go our way. And I don't know exactly what the connection between business and government is, but we all know that money's playing a big role in our country right now. It seems to be an issue with many people. What is going on with our democracy? It seems like that cleavage, you mentioned our ideals, but it seems to me the cleavage between our ideals and what we actually do has just widened. And you may say that, you know, rendition is over and we don't do this and we don't do that. I don't know why it can't come back in a moment's notice. I just don't trust what's going on anymore. I'm just, you know, as I said, it's difficult for me to talk about.
And since it's the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, then how is this role of the United States in reference to Israel and Palestine? What kind of a good partner, neutral partner, as the U.S. played? Because it's completely pro-Israeli, except for Obama. Of course, Obama has tried, not successfully, but he has tried. But look at what a mess. We are part of that mess.
Well, sounds like a caucus in Iowa, you know. I'm not running for office. You know, it is true that as a career diplomat, you know, your basic role is to espouse the administration's line, and if you're really unhappy with it, then you resign. And so, you know, I'm not going to create policy for you here.
We won't tell on you.
But no, you know, look, the point that mistakes were made because in the name of the Cold War, in the name of fighting communism, that's widely accepted now. The number of things that we did, including bolster colonial regimes, because we thought if we don't, then they'll fall to the communists. You know, in retrospect, we missed the ball, we missed the boat. You know, Ho Chi Minh was a partner at the end of World War II. And, you know, we had an opportunity to work with him. There were people inside the government saying, don't alienate him, we can actually work with this guy. But we felt we had to support the French. Okay, maybe lesson learned. One of my great idols is George Kennan. And I've read pretty much everything he's written, and I've read John Gaddis's biography of him, and I'm reading halfway through the diaries now. I don't think there's anything left to read about Kennan. But, you know, he's got a lot of good thinking on this issue, and he'd be the first to admit that mistakes were made because of this overriding obsession with defeating communism, and the failure of analysis to understand that some things that were happening here were due to nationalism, and you know, communism was just a useful ideological platform to pursue a nationalist agenda, which wasn't necessarily hostile to the United States. So, you know, thanks to what you're doing in the classroom and what professors here are doing, hopefully the next you know, generation is going to approach it better informed. The other part of this is, you know, the structures that were put into place after World War II, the UN Security Council with the 5 veto-wielding powers, the Bretton Woods institutions. You know, how relevant and functional are these institutions to the situation we face today? You know, why, when Germany is the most powerful country in Europe and the EU is virtually a state almost in itself, should France and Britain be the 2 veto-wielding European powers in the Security Council? Why isn't Germany, why don't they have a veto? Why doesn't Japan and Brazil and South Africa and India, you know, why don't they have it? Well, because nobody who has something is going to give it up, is why. So, but there's still efforts to try to you know, Security Council reform is a huge priority in terms of how we deal with global problems. You know, it would be so much better if the obviously more powerful countries in the world were all speaking with one voice on something like ISIS. You know, and they speak with one voice, but they don't have all equal clout. And you know, you'll have measures that are undertaken in the Security Council, and the Russians will veto them, or the Chinese, and you know, would that be the case if you broadened the veto power? So that, I think the post-war institutions need reform. There's no question about it. And that people understand it now, but making it happen is still a challenge. On the role of the military, I mean, I'm with you that, what I found in Afghanistan was, again, I went in there first with 7 soldiers. And I thought we were a pretty effective little team. But the kind of military mentality is, well, if X times 1 works pretty well, then X times 3 will work 3 times better, and X times 100 will work 100 times better. And in fact, in a place like Afghanistan, that's not the case. But we got too big, too heavy, and we are not agile enough. And it became a situation where we were carrying the big load, and the Afghans are going, well, you guys are pretty good. You know what you're doing. Well, why don't you guys can lead the way? Instead of, this is their country. It has to be their fight. It has to be their development challenge. And so we got too big. Now we're scaled back, and I think it's a more appropriate level. But America's military is a remarkable institution, and I've worked closely with them. I've been the deputy commandant at the National War College. What's the National War College about? It's about teaching colonels and Navy captains that modern international relations is not about who can take that hill or sink that ship. It's about how do you develop partnerships across the globe, how do you find ways to avoid conflict rather than... And so I think as an institution, these are the people who understand you really don't want to fight, but it's something that we can bring to the equation that can really make a difference. And like in Central Asia right now, when you ask yourself, what does the U.S. bring to the equation? Well, I don't see General Motors there. Well, actually, I take that back. There is a Chevrolet plant in Uzbekistan, but it's part of the GM from Korea, actually. We don't have a lot of our companies there. We don't have dance troops. Those 10,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, that whole region is looking at that and saying, thank God the Americans are there. Please don't let them leave. And, let that be part of making this situation, getting it right. So I still think, on balance, our military as an institution is these are people who follow the directions of the political leadership. And there are many countries where that's not the case. So the real issue is what are they being told to do by the political leadership? And sometimes the political leadership will say, do this, and they'll get a little too zealous and maybe get a little carried away. But, bottom line is they're not off doing their own thing. They could be a really positive force in American international engagement, especially since most of this military engagement is not seizing a hill or sinking a ship. It's training forces. It's telling foreign militaries, the most important part of your military structure is the sergeants. It's the people who are going to be learning to think for themselves, who are going to mentor their younger soldiers. It's not about who gets to have the most stars on their shoulder and be the dictator of the country. So I'm just putting in a little plug here that, like it or not, when we look at what we still bring to the equation globally, our military can be a really powerful and positive factor if it's done right. And that's the key question, is it done right? And are they linked to business? It's worth looking at. Wasn't it Eisenhower who warned about the military-industrial complex? Do people go out and try to stoke tension so that people will come and buy arms? And then you also got into tribal issues and who shot whose cousin and who stole whose camel and stuff like that. And then it became, but when we talk about the Taliban, at one level, it's simply rural people, tribesmen fighting for their territory and their clan. Then it got hijacked by people like Bin Laden, and now ISIS has come in, and it's taken on an ideological tinge. But the recruiting is largely done among uneducated, poor people. These guys will come in, they'll come to a family. There's one kid maybe who's got physical, medical problems. They'll say, we'll take care of you, but we need one kid to come with us, take him to madrasa, indoctrinate him, and send him off with a suicide bomb. Is that the Taliban, or is that rural tribesmanship, or is that just, some new tyrant who's figured out another way to hijack people? So I think we have to, when we talk about the Taliban, it's a broad, sweeping term, and part of the phenomenon in Afghanistan is just educating and developing the whole country. That's going to take a generation. Part of the problem is, cutting off that link between extremists from outside who are trying to drive an ideological agenda with money from the Middle East. I mean, the Saudis are a huge problem when it comes to the Taliban and ISIS. They're bankrolling, some people in Saudi Arabia are bankrolling these extremists. And, this is something that the Middle East and the Arab world really needs to get a handle on. So that would be my answer, and maybe you want to add something.
I was just going to say that when we talk about Taliban, we have to, of course, realize the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that preceded us, and lots of young people ending up in refugee camps in Pakistan who became radicalized because they were alienated and mistreated. So I'm not excusing what Taliban is doing, but these young men needed some right. Yeah. Mujahideen and Taliban. Taliban means students basically, and so there is a connection there. I think you can ignore. And also, Central Asians were fighting. Uzbeks were fighting under the Soviet military. They were fighting their co-religionists in Afghanistan. So.
And you have that phenomenon, actually, you have the Taliban in Afghanistan, but you also have a different Taliban in Pakistan.
Right.
And it's not clear that they would necessarily get along. And then you've got the Pakistani authorities who on the one hand are kind of battling their own Taliban, but on the other hand, it appears at some level are also supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that goes back to a different strategic set of issues having to do with the huge level of distrust between Pakistan and India. And you won't really solve Afghanistan until you develop a much higher level of trust between India and Pakistan. Certainly.
I want to piggyback my points on your experience when you were appointed ambassador. Was it in Pakistan or?
In Uzbekistan and then Georgia.
Yeah. Specifically, I haven't been in Pakistan, but I've been to Ghana. I'm a Ghanaian, and the U.S. Embassy was engaging the Ghanaian Muslim community, and there were a series of events during the Ramadan. I was supposed to come here for the program, and then the information officer asked me if I could help my Ghanaian experience to help cover the greater program, so I asked. As part of the activities, I realized at one point that Daniel Peale, the journalist who got killed in Pearl.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was the anniversary of his death, one or the second or so. And then there was an event organized at the residence of then U.S. Ambassador to Ghana. And the timing was between Maghrib and Isha, and this was during Ramadan time. This timing is actually very sensitive to all Muslims when everybody was supposed to be either breaking the fast or getting ready to go to the mosque. Like the time when we break. So some scholars, the chief imam, chief priest was invited as well. And guess what? The content of the event was troubling to a whole lot of scholars. So how can we come and listen to jazz in commemoration of Daniel Peale? This is too troubling. We don't support what happened, but our sentiment is taken as this is not appropriate for this. Well, this mutual respect can perhaps really consult as to what is appropriate to be done. Instead of imposing something that is contrary to the timing is wrong. And then secondly as well, there was also one celebrity who came to Ghana. She is a stripper working with Hollywood. She's Hollywood. And then she came in and she was sent to Lima with all set of school children covered, and then she was just among them. And then she was supposed to be a hero to them. That's the contrast. So, I mean,
I'm not being political, whatever, but this is a general observation with your background with the State Department, perhaps, if you want to revise some notes.
Well, I will certainly take that back with me. It goes without saying that it's the responsibility of every ambassador and embassy to be culturally appropriate, and this is a moving target too. What Muslim populations consider appropriate and acceptable today is different than what was maybe the case 5 years ago, and it depends on the country. But it's certainly the role of the embassy to try to be on top of that, and I'm sorry if people felt offended. Thank you very much.
Thank you.